Hey guys, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to World of Tanks. I've been on the test server checking out the brand new branch of Czechoslovakian medium tanks that will be coming in update 9.13. This video will preview all of them, give you an overview of how the tech tree develops, and so maybe you can decide which ones you might keep and which ones you simply have to grind through if you want to check out this new tech tree. Also, stay tuned to the channel as I'll be previewing the brand new Pilsane map, which will be coming to the random queue in another video, as well as giving you full gameplay previews of monsters such as this Tier 10 Czechoslovakian TVP 5051. Which is fairly similar to a bat chat. So the entire new branch of Czechoslovakian tanks can be found in the tech tree, starting with the T1 tank, the Kolo-Helsinka. The Kolo-Helsinka was apparently one of the first representatives of Czechoslovakian armored vehicles, a light-wheeled caterpillar tank that was developed in the late 1920s based on the suspension of a Hanomag WD-50 tractor. But the vehicle never saw service as it was deemed to be obsolete by the end of its development. Poor old Kolo-Helsinka indeed. It looks absolutely ridiculous. The tank pretty much has no armor at all, 14mm at its thickest and 8mm on the side, 6 at the rear, meaning this is a very juicy target for any tank in the game, especially those with autocannons. It has a 40mm main armament that is actually a pretty nice gun. It's got 1.9 seconds aim time, 0.42 accuracy, 50 alpha damage with 45mm of penetration, and a healthy 19.35 rate of fire, which performs in a very similar fashion to the 45mm on the Soviet Tier 1 light tank, the MS-1. However, don't expect to get anywhere fast in this tank. It has a 50 horsepower engine, which gives this vehicle a terrible specific power ratio, worse than many of the slowest heavy tanks in the game, and has a top speed limit of 25 kilometers an hour, so don't think this is going to be some kind of a little pimp T1. Taking the jump up into Tier 2 is the LTVZ-35, which was developed by the Skoda company. The vehicle saw service in the Czechoslovakian army as an infantry support vehicle from 1936 through to 1937, and 298 of these machines were manufactured. This vehicle is pretty much a copy of the Panzerkampfwagen 35T, and I expect is going to be very forgettable indeed, with its top armament this 37mm, which while do consistent damage, isn't anything surprising. Next, you step up to the LTVZ-38, which was developed in 1938 and saw service in the Wehrmacht under the designation Panzerkampfwagen 38T, which is unsurprising why these machines are so similar to current German vehicles already in the game. It is considered to be the best Czechoslovakian service vehicle, and due to that, a total of 1,400 of these vehicles were produced. Interestingly, while the German does get this flat cannon, this 2cm flat cannon, the LTVZ-38 gets a 37mm autoloader. Now, you can use a single-shot autoloader, but this is something that is very interesting about the Czechoslovakian autoloaders. They often have better stats than the non-autoloader versions of the guns on the same tanks. Usually with vehicles such as the M41 Walker Bulldog, if you use an autoloader, you have worse aim time, usually worse accuracy for the same penetration. On many of the Czechoslovakian tanks, such as this one, you have the same accuracy and you have more penetration, 21mm more. That's a third more penetration if you choose to use the autoloader on this vehicle. And so I say, why not? No way am I going to use that gun if I can use this one with 82mm of penetration on a Tier 3 light tank. And so that means that this vehicle is probably going to play in a fairly similar way to the Cruiser 4, with that 40mm Bofors cannon that has 4 instead of 3 shells per magazine. The difference with the Bofors, however, is that you have more alpha damage, 50 rather than 40, and it takes half as long to fire each one of the shells, with a delay of only 0.5 rather than 1 second. Now, the LTVZ-38 does have the superior penetration, but the Cruiser Mark IV has vastly superior mobility with a stonking specific power ratio that the LTVZ-38 could only dream of. And so while I expect a lot of people are going to enjoy this Tier 3 Czechoslovakian light tank, there are, in my opinion, more competitive vehicles in the game already. So this marks the end of the light tanks. Now we're going to take a step up to the medium tanks, starting with the STVZ-39. This tank was developed in the end of the 1930s as a further development of the LTVZ-35. While 2 prototypes were manufactured, trials revealed multiple faults in their design and the vehicle never entered mass production. The STVZ-39 does not have an autoloader. This is the top gun on the tank, this 47mm. And this is where things get kind of confusing for me, because did you just see the gun on that previous Tier 3 light tank? The penetration has only gone up by 4mm. In fact, the aim time has gone down, with the accuracy barely improving. However, the alpha damage is now 60 rather than 40, but you lose that autoloader capability. When I compare this to, for example, the best-in-class Tier 4 medium tank, in my opinion, the Matilda, things start to get fairly ugly very quickly for this gun's capabilities. While the tank does have slightly better alpha damage of 60 rather than 55, it loses this advantage due to the rate of fire differences in a pure DPM output. And now this is where it gets really ugly for the STV-Z39. The penetration on the Matilda is nearly 50% better, at 121 rather than 86. Also, the Matilda has the same accuracy, but slightly better aim time. And let's not even begin to compare the armor of the Matilda, which is 75mm pretty much all around apart from on the back of the hull. And that's something that the Czechoslovakian Tier 4 medium tank simply just can't compare with. With only 32mm on the hull armor, you're not going to be bouncing anything in this vehicle outside of some lucky bounces with the turret. However, the STV-Z39 does have significantly better mobility than the Matilda, but it's still rather underwhelming, only getting a 15 specific power ratio. And I expect this thing will be skipped through or will be cannon fodder for most Tier 5 and Tier 6 tanks. Next up is the Skoda, the T24. And boy, this thing looks absolutely ridiculous. It's a huge tank in comparison to the Tier 4, but surprisingly it doesn't actually weigh as much as I thought it would. It's less than 20 tons. It gets a standard 450 hit points and is very fast indeed, with a 58 km/h top speed limit and a fairly decent traverse speed of 40 degrees a second. Now, if you thought this tank was going to get armor just because of its size, you might be a little disappointed. It has 50mm at the front of the hull and the turret, with 30 at the side and 30 at the rear. That makes this a very big, delicious snack for any high explosive rounds. I see a lot of 105mm one-shotting this tank, or God forbid when it has to meet something like an OI or a KV2, this thing is going to get one shot pretty much every time. Nevertheless, hopefully you can use the conjunction of mobility of this tank with this fairly competitive 75mm to be able to pick apart your opponents. The penetration increase is dramatic, taking the step up to Tier 5. You get 132mm of penetration with 110 alpha damage, 0.38 accuracy and 2.3 seconds aim time. Now, while you wouldn't think it by looking at the design of this turret, this vehicle actually does get 10 degrees of gun depression, which adds significant flexibility to this tank and does allow you to fight on some ridge lines. However, when you do compare this gun to the standard 75mm on another Tier 5 German tank, such as the Panzerfire H, you might quickly realize that this gun isn't all that. The alpha damage is the same, but the rate of fire is a paltry 11.32 compared to the 15 rounds a minute that the Panzerfire fires, with the accuracy being barely better and the aim time being the same. And so this vehicle doesn't really have a competitive gun. It doesn't really have competitive armor. It better damn well make use of its mobility if it wants to be effective on the battlefield. Next up is the Tier 6 Czechoslovakian medium tank, the Skoda T50. Okay, unfortunately for us, this is another tank that is pretty much already in the game, right? The Panzerkampfwagen T25 is a premium vehicle at Tier 5 inside the German branch. The model has just been copied, I guess, and put up as a Tier 6 Czechoslovakian medium tank. A further development of the T24 medium tank. This vehicle was developed for the German army in 1942 and the project was deemed outdated. No prototypes were manufactured. So how does it compete in World of Tanks? Well, it has a very standard hit point, 730. Not the heaviest of tanks, and it also gets a rather meaty 500 horsepower engine, which gives this vehicle a rather nice specific power ratio of about 20. It also has a great top speed limit of 60 kilometers an hour, but a terrible traverse speed of 30 degrees a second, which will really hamper this thing when it has to try and use that fairly good engine power and top speed through corners. The armor again is complete trash, 50 on the front, 50 on the side, and 35 at the rear. So hopefully it gets some good gun mechanics, right? Well, yes, it does actually. It has a 75mm autoloader. And as I mentioned earlier, you would be a fool to use the single shotgun, as you would have worse accuracy, worse aim time, and not have the benefits of being able to pick apart your enemies and burst damage. Now this is quite a novel gun to have on a tier 6 medium tank. Its penetration is rather low, 132, doesn't add up well compared to vehicles such as the Cromwell, and its alpha damage is 110, so that's pretty much the same as you had on the previous tier on the T24. However, this vehicle's accuracy is mediocre, but its aim time is a decent 2.1 seconds, so you shouldn't spend long aiming those 3 75mm shells that you can have in each magazine. This vehicle will effectively be able to do 330 damage on average in just over 2.5 seconds from the first shot. And so that's something that a lot of vehicles are going to have to worry about. It's pretty much like a Chi-Ri at tier 6. And when you combine this with the fact that the vehicle gets 10 degrees of gun depression, I think that this is going to be an absolute painless grind, if you know how to use an autoloader. Next, we take a step up to tier 7, where we are going to see the Constructa T34-100. Oh god, it's a T34 at tier 7. Well, at least the hull is, with what looks to be a T43 turret, right? Let's take a look at the information. This is a development project of the T34-85 tank that was proposed in April 1954. The Czechoslovakian variant of the vehicle was to receive a 100mm gun and an enlarged turret. Production was planned to start in 1955, however, it never started. Now what we have here really is rather disappointing mobility for this vehicle. It gets a 520 horsepower engine, but due to the size of the turret, I believe it weighs 34 tons, meaning this gets a bad specific power ratio. And I did check also the ground resistances of this vehicle, and they're rather mediocre as well, meaning that this thing is going to be able to struggle to get up to its top speed limit of 54 kilometers an hour. And its 38 degrees a second traverse speed isn't going to really help it too much in corners. I think the model of this tank does look rather nice indeed. It's very pleasing, but just don't depend on your hull armor, as it's the same as the tier 5 Soviet medium tank. 45 degrees all round, albeit the front is angled. Maybe you can pull off some miracle bounces against maybe some tier 5 tanks that you will meet. But really your only chance is to try and use the 90mm of turret armor that this vehicle gets, avoiding them shooting your cupola, to be able to take on your opponents. Now let's take a look at the 100mm main armament that this vehicle can use. Well, that's actually a lot better than I thought. The aim time is a rather decent 2.4 seconds, with the accuracy at 0.38. The alpha damage is standard 250 for 100mm, and the penetration is 175, with the rate of fire just over 7. So just how good is it to have like a tier 8 medium tank gun at tier 7? Well, let's try and compare it with vehicles that are already in the game that kind of try and do the same thing. Here we have the Constructa T34-100, and we're going to compare it to other similar vehicles, such as the T34-1, the T20, and of course the A44, which actually even has higher alpha damage. So the T34-100 has the highest DPM of any of these vehicles. It also has the joint highest penetration with the T34-1. The tank's aim time also significantly beats the T34-1 using that 100mm and the A44 using that 107mm, but is just pipped by the T20 using that 90mm. The accuracy of the tank is also the joint best with the T20, but its dispersion is the worst with the T34-1. Now unfortunately the depression of the tank at most is 5 degrees, whereas the T20 gets 10 degrees, which is lovely. The forward speed of the tank is right in the middle, better than the T34-1 but not as good as the T20 or the A44, and its specific power ratio is on par with the A44, not as good as the T20 or the T34-1, but it has better ground resistances than the T34-1 and the T20, but worse than the A44. So this means that the vehicle is likely to have pretty much the same, if not better, mobility than the T34-1, worse mobility than the T20, and also the A44. Now it's really when it comes to the armor that you see this tank suffer. Its hull armor doesn't even compare to the other vehicles, and its turret armor is dominated by the T34-1, but at least it's in comparison with the A44, although that's really not very good turret armor, right? And so what we really found is that while the T34-100 probably has the best gun out of all of them, it doesn't have the flexibility that the T20 has to use it, and it doesn't have the mobility or indeed the alpha damage impact that the A44 has, or the turret armor of the T34-1. Personally, I'd probably rather play the T34-1 and try and get hull down and use the very nice 170mm of turret armor that that tank gets. And I feel like the T34-100 might be a quite challenging grind, and you're simply going to get picked apart by tanks with better DPM or with superior armor. So next up is the Tier 8, the TVP VTU concept, and oh my word, it looks a lot like the premium vehicle, the Skoda T50, right? Oh yes, the model is pretty much exactly the same. The Armour model is the same, 65mm at the front, 40 at the side, 30 at the rear. And the mobility of the vehicles, well, the top speed is the same as well. The engine power, the same. The weight, at least it's a little bit lighter. It weighs 4.5 tons less than the Skoda T50. That's the Tier 6 Premium Czechoslovakian medium tank, which is already in the game and I've been using to train up my crew. And so if you've played the Skoda T50, you'll know that its armor is not great at Tier 6, and it's going to do even worse at Tier 8. This is a big, juicy, tasty snack that is going to meet even Tier 10 vehicles. And its mobility isn't that much better than the Skoda T50. But it's alright, this vehicle gets pretty much a 20 specific power ratio, with a top speed limit of 50 kilometers an hour and a traverse speed of 44 degrees a second. So it better have some darn good guns, hey? Well, it has a plethora of guns available to it. It can use a 100mm gun, an 88mm gun, or a 105mm gun. Let's take a look at the differences between them. So here we're comparing between the 88mm, the 100mm in the center, and the 105mm on the right. Immediately we see that bigger is not always better, at least when it comes to DPM, with the 88mm having the highest, stepping down to the 100, and finally the 105. When it comes to penetration, the 88mm has 194mm, while the 100mm has 175, and the 105mm has 188. With the alpha damage, it's 240, 250, 320, meaning that the difference between the 88 and the 105 is negligible, with a fairly big step up of 33% alpha damage if you want to use the 105 rather than the 88. So what about the weapon handling? Well, there is a massive advantage to using the 88 with regards to aim time, and also a significant advantage in accuracy compared to the 105, and a slight advantage compared to the 100mm. And so for me, it looks like the 88mm gun is going to be the most competitive. Unfortunately, all of these guns get 6 degrees of gun depression, which is a very disappointing aspect of this vehicle. I was really hoping, considering how mediocre the hull armor is, how mediocre the mobility of the tank is, that it was going to get some kind of absolutely kick-ass armament. And it looks like while the 88mm is a rather decent gun, with 6 degrees of gun depression, I feel like this is going to be a very weak Tier 8 medium tank. And so far you might be thinking, well, what's going on with these new Czechoslovakian tanks? Pretty much all mediocre so far, right? Or copies of others. Well, this is where the party starts. Now we are looking at the Skoda T50. This is the Tier 9 Czechoslovakian medium tank, and it looks like some kind of gangster IS-3 that decided to lift up its hull armor by about a meter. The Skoda T50 is a further development of the post-war concept for a Czechoslovakian general-purpose vehicle. The Skoda project, developed in the 1947, allowed for mounting a more powerful 100mm gun based on the Soviet D-10 gun. However, no prototypes were manufactured. What a shame, because this vehicle does look like an absolute novelty. The tank weighs just shy of 39 tons and has a 1,000 horsepower engine, with a low chance to be set on fire of 10%. That means that this thing can race around the battlefield with a very healthy specific power ratio of nearly 26. When you combine this with the top speed limit of the tank of 50 kilometers an hour and 42 degrees a second traverse speed, you know this is a mobile vehicle. Well, how about the armor? Well, it's a very disappointing 65 at the front of the hull, and this lower plate is gigantic and not very well angled. Pretty much a huge shoot me here marker for every single tank this will meet. But the turret armor is another situation altogether. There's 120mm of frontal turret armor, 80 at the side and 60 at the rear. Now, while the vehicle does have a cupola that can be shot, without going into too much detail as this is a preview of the tank, its mantlet is incredible. Pretty much everything that hits this mantlet will be unable to penetrate the tank. But as we can see, it is quite a small triangle over the turret, and the rest of the front of this face is pretty much going to be penetrated by any tank this will meet, apart from maybe some Tier 7s. But still, this is a hell of a lot better than every single tank previously in the line. And now this is where it gets really interesting. This vehicle has a 100mm with a 3 magazine autoloader. This is a novelty in World of Tanks. There's no other gun quite like this. French autoloaders such as the Lorraine or the AMX 5100 have got 300 alpha damage. However, this tank has got 320. For vehicles such as the 5100, you might be saying, are a whole tier lower and also have 6 shells per magazine, right? Well, yes, that might be the case, but you've also got to consider how quickly it can dump the shells out. And the Skoda T50 only has 1.8 seconds delay between each of the shots. And when you've got more alpha damage at 320, the burst potential of this tank is so much higher than other non-top tier autoloaders. Let's compare this tank, for example, to a Lorraine and an AMX 5120 that are both using the 100mm gun. Well, the Skoda T40 has nearly 15% better DPM than the Lorraine. It also has better penetration by 16mm than the French 100mm gun. The tank also has a much smaller magazine, which doesn't allow you to dish out as much damage per full unload, but the advantage of that is that you manage to reload your tank in 2/3 of the time that the 5120 would, and nearly half the time that the Lorraine would. And one of the most important aspects of this tank is the unload time, 1.8 seconds, whereas the French 100mm take 2.73 seconds to fire a shell. So what this means is that if you fire at the same time as a Lorraine, you're going to be able to finish unloading your clip, giving you 960 average damage for the magazine in 3.6 seconds. Whereas it's going to take him 5.5 seconds to do 900 damage to you. And so what that means is that if you can control the engagement and stop him from using the rest of his magazine with the fairly good mobility that this tank gets, you can outburst other autoloaders as well as go to town on medium tanks. And the good news doesn't end here. While you are doing more alpha damage, you've got significantly better aim time than the other vehicles, as well as slightly better accuracy and comparable gun depression of 8 degrees. This vehicle is pretty much going to behave as a Lorraine, with 15% better DPM, very similar mobility, and having the opportunity to bounce if you can go hull down in the vehicle. And that personally for me makes the Skoda T50 the first interesting vehicle in the Czechoslovakian branch. And I'm probably going to be forgetting about all of the tanks until I get to tier 9. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be a pain to grind through to get to feel what I think is the competitive novelty in this line. And guys, I'm very happy to say that the good news does not end at tier 9. Here is the TVP T5051, the top tier Czechoslovakian medium tank that is going to give the Batchat a run for its money. The TVP T5051 was a joint project by Skoda and CKD. And while they began discussions in January 1950, the project was discontinued in March by the Czechoslovakian Military of Defense, and no prototypes were manufactured, existing only in blueprints. But don't let that poop on your parade, let's focus on the stats. It has 1,800 hit points, which is the same as the Batchat, a little underwhelming for a vehicle that does look very fat, unlike the French medium tank. It weighs just over 40 tons with another meaty 1,000 horsepower engine, which allows this thing to shift up to its top speed limit of 60 kilometers an hour, which is 10 kilometers an hour faster than the Skoda T50, and has a decent traverse speed of 54 degrees a second. The tank's armor is pretty much the same as the previous vehicle, having 65 at the front, although now the lower plate is a much smaller target, and 120mm of turret armor that works in pretty much the same way. This triangular mantlet will absorb everything. However, be careful, this cupola is a good target for the enemy, and outside of that, you're only going to get bounces if you're lucky indeed. So what about the gun? Well, yes, it gets an autoloader again, a 100mm autoloader, but it is so much better. And that's because, unlike the Skoda T50 at tier 9, this thing has 4 rounds per magazine, with only 1.5 second delay between each shell. And now this is where I put in a disclaimer that remember, this is the first test server and everything is subject to change. I can only get excited about what I see now, and I have no idea whether this tank will be nerfed or buffed before release. And that goes for all of the vehicles that I've talked about in this preview. The vehicle has 248mm of penetration with its standard APCR rounds and 310 with its heat rounds, with 320 alpha damage, 0.35 accuracy, and 2.1 seconds aim time. Also, this vehicle gets 410 meters view range, which is very nice indeed, and you probably don't even need to use coated optics on this tank. But it's dubious whether you need a gun-laying drive, and I still haven't quite decided whether a gun-laying drive or a coated optics will be best for this tank, because the aim time is an excellent 2.1 seconds, but when you only have 1.5 seconds delay between each of your shots, you do need excellent aim time in this vehicle. So it's undeniable that comparisons must be made between the TVP T50-51 and the Batchat. And that's something that I'm going to be doing in a video I will release tomorrow, where I'll be showing you some monstrous gameplay and the capabilities of this Tier 10 Czechoslovakian medium tank, where I'll also go into some more detail about how the vehicle compares to the Tier 10 French medium tank and whether it's likely to replace it. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, or maybe it was just useful to you. If it was, please do consider giving it a like down below. It really helps the channel out. And as I mentioned earlier, stay tuned to the channel. I'm going to be doing a preview of the new map, multiple gameplays of these new tanks with more detailed analysis, as well as a talk through about buffs and nerfs that are happening to the vehicles that are already in the game. And let me know in the comments down below what you guys think about this new Czechoslovakian Tech Tree. Are you rather underwhelmed about some of the tanks? Do you think that a few of them are going to be overpowered? Are you excited or disappointed? Let me know. And as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.